this video, we're going to take a look at the economic impacts of immigration from one region to another, or just as more broadly we'll call it, labor migration. So our two regions are North and South, and the North has a higher hourly wage. So here we have the labor market for the North, and in equilibrium, we have a wage of $6 an hour. In the South, we have a much lower wage of $2 an hour. So what would happen is if, this difference might exist, say, if we have no immigration allowed whatsoever. So then what would happen if we allowed migration to take place? Well, you'd expect workers from the South would start to migrate to the North. And this will happen up until the point where where we're going to end up with a wage difference that's going to match what we call the cost, and we're going to label that with a C, the cost of migration, right? And these are hourly wages, then it's going to be the cost stated on an hourly basis. So what happens here in the South when the migrants leave, that means that the supply of labor shifts to the left. Right? And so here we have this supply curve here is now the supply curve of those remaining workers. Right? So the book labels that with an R. We'll say that wage then rises to 3.2. Right? And so those workers move from the South to the North, and so they would actually get added in here. And so as they come in here, and just to keep it a little cleaner, we're not going to actually put extra supply curve in there. Say that the wage in the North drops to 5. Okay? We don't actually need to show it here because we're going to keep track of the migrants with their supply curve here. Right? So the difference between this supply curve here, this is the supply curve just with those workers who remain in South. This supply curve out here includes the migrants plus those who, right? So this is all the workers who are initially in the South before the migration occurs. Okay? And so what is this difference, this 5 minus 3.2? Well, that's got to be the cost of migration, right? Otherwise, more and more workers would leave South and move to the North, right? And as that continues to happen, the wages in the South would rise, they would fall in the North until they would equalize. And if there were no costs of migration, that's what we would expect to happen. But of course, we know in reality there are costs to migration. There are, of course, the out-of-pocket costs that you have to go through in terms of moving to another country. But perhaps even more significantly than those out-of-pocket costs are the psychological costs associated with leaving your homeland and moving to another country. Okay? And we'll talk a bit more about what those costs might be in class. But for now, just take it that C includes both the psychological and the out-of-pocket costs of migration. And so in this case, that hourly, stated in hourly terms, that's a cost of $1.80. What about all of how do we track the changes in surplus for all the different groups? Well, let's start off with the migrants, okay? And so as we said, we're tracking them here in this, right, in this graph. Right. And so again, when we're looking at this, we want to ask the question of, well, right, what's the change in their welfare? Well, if you look at it, so their supply, right, the supply of the migrants gives us the difference between these two supply curves. Right? When they leave, we see the wage going up, right, for the remaining workers from 2 to 3.2. Now, of course, in reality, when the migrants move to the North, their wage is going to go to $5. But we need to net out the $1.80 in costs from that higher wage. So on net, the migrants, they're getting paid $5 an hour, but we have to net out those migration costs of 1.8, which gives us this 3.2. And so that's why we can actually use this wage of 3.2 to help show the gains to these workers, to the migrants. And so in the book, they label that as E and F, right? So their surplus, remember, workers in a labor market, the workers are the producers. So their producer surplus is the area above their supply curve, right, and up to the wage. And so in this case, when the wage goes from 2 to 3.2, they gain in surplus the area between these two supply curves and between the original and the new wage. So the migrants gain E plus F. Remember, those gains are accounting for the costs of migration. What about for Southern workers? Well, for the Southern workers, and the book actually labels this as D, right, Southern workers, their wage goes from $2 to $3.2 an hour. And of course, more of them, right, they're going to have more hours of employment as the wage goes up. They're going to be willing to work more hours. Okay? So they gain D. What about the employers in the South? Well, the employers in the South, they're paying more, right? Now, the employers make up the demand for labor, right? Companies are the demand side of a labor market, right? The employers. So they make up or they're the ones who get the consumer surplus, right? They're the consumers of labor. When the wage goes up from 2 to 3.2, employment drops from 82 to 70. Okay? So they're going to employ 12 million fewer hours of labor, and they're going to have to pay more for the 70 million hours of labor that they still employ. They're going to have to pay $1.20 an hour more, so their surplus drops by D and E. Right. So if you think about for the South, right, or at least those who are remaining in the South, right, there's a net change here. Right? The workers gain D, but the employers lose D and E, so their net loss here is of E. And again, that's taking the migrants and not counting them in South anymore because they're no longer there. We're going to count them as their own separate group. What about workers in the North? Well, the workers in the North, in the book labels these areas as A and B. Okay? Employment initially was 100 million hours, and that total employment will rise to 110. But that 110 includes the migrants. Right? What you actually have is disemployment for the native workers, or the native workers in the North are the ones who are already there. Okay? There's disemployment of 10 million hours for native northern workers. They lose area A, right? Again, this is the supply curve of labor. The workers are the supply curve. Right? Their surplus goes down by A. And the firms are the demand curve, right? They're going to increase their total employment from 100, or consumption of labor, from 100 to 110 million hours. And they're going to pay $1 less per hour than they would have before the immigration takes place. So the increase in the consumer surplus is A plus B. So that for the North, right, for the individuals who are, the workers and the firms who are always in the North, they have a net gain of plus B. And so you can see the gain there, right, is B. And it's that triangle. Right? So you have the migrants gain E and F, but E, of course, comes at the expense of the Southern employers. As far as global welfare is concerned, those E's cancel each other. So there's the gain of E, and then in the North, you have the employers gaining B. So there's a net gain of B and E, okay? B and F, right? Which is this triangle, right? These are our gains triangles. Very similar to when we started the course. When we started the course and we showed gains from trade, from importing, right? And there were these triangles that we saw here. If you're an importer, right? Well, there's an analogy here, right? Because it's like the North is importing the Southern workers, the migrants. That's why we see a very similar gains here for the home country. This should look very familiar. Really, it's not new what you're seeing here. It's exactly what we saw back in chapter 2 when we talked about importing goods. Okay? Now, in the example that we just did here, we assumed that the migrants and the native workers in the north are substitutes for each other. Right? With a very simplified example here, we have homogeneous labor. Right? There's no differentiation in labor, and the migrants are directly competing for the same jobs as the native workers in the north. Okay? And so that's why you get this scenario where the native workers in the north lose out. But some of the questions we want to ask are, well, what happens when the native workers in the north, or maybe some of them at least, are, instead of substitutes, right, instead of the migrants being substitutes for them, what if they're complementary? Right? What happens if they do different kinds of jobs and the influx of migrants actually makes the native workers more productive? Could actually lead to higher wages for them, so they might benefit. How might native workers, even those who initially are competing with the migrants, how might their labor supply respond to the presence of the migrants? Right? And so we will talk about that in class. We'll talk about some of the interesting recent research that shows what some of these effects might be. Okay? But these questions also highlight for us why we see such very different opinions towards immigration, and that they really, very frequently, how workers view immigration and whether it is beneficial for the society as a whole and for themselves personally depends on whether those individuals in the receiving country are competing with these workers, or if in fact they are doing complementary work and benefiting from the presence of these workers.